morning. It is very good to be back with you again and celebrate the Sabbath, have an opportunity to worship the Lord here at Pueblo. Thank you all for being kind enough to invite me. And I'm going to start off with a passage that I think we're all familiar with, Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Anybody else? Does that echo with them? You feel that. You've experienced, you know that. Isn't it good that that's not the end of the story, though? Anybody recognize anyone in this photo? Okay, I'll help you out a little bit. The one off the one side who's looking away, the shorter one there, Sports Illustrated refers to him as an unidentified bat boy. Okay? Well, there's a famous person on the other side there. Hall of Fame pitcher Whitey Ford. And they're both looking away from the guy in the middle who's going to be the focus for a little bit here. His name is George Plimpton. Anyone heard that name before? And I thought some of the older ones might be because he became incredibly famous for a period during the 1960s. George Plimpton was raised in a well-to-do family, went to a finishing school, you know, one of those highbrow things that get you ready for an Ivy League education, which he got at Harvard. And immediately after leaving Harvard, he founded a literary magazine called the Paris Review. Now, it was one of those magazines that stayed around and managed to keep publishing only because somebody was pumping money into it because there wasn't much readership. I've never even seen a copy of it, let alone read anything in it. Turns out the Paris Review was a front for the CIA. George Plimpton was a spy. He was more than that. He did a stint in the Army where he was a demolitions expert. And that led to some time after the war in which he eventually became the fireworks commissioner for the city of New York, in which capacity he set a record for the largest Roman candle ever shot. It was actually on his second attempt. On his first attempt, he set a record for the biggest hole left in the ground by an attempted firework. George Plimpton blew stuff up. Getting to be a real man's man here, isn't he? Well, he was tall and he was skinny and he was not quite the athlete that he was in his dreams as a younger man. But as a writer, he decided one day he wondered what it would be like to pitch, because he'd been a pitcher in high school, against actual professionals, and to write about that experience. So he contacted Sports Illustrated and gave them his idea, and they said, we'll fund it and we'll publish the article afterwards. So in the late 1950s, he made an arrangement that he was going to pitch to everybody in the order of the National League All-Stars and then the American League All-Stars. This was at the end of the season, not the middle of the year All-Star game. They used to do two of them, one after the season also. And so this was the late one. Excuse me. I'm going to clear my throat, so guys in the back. There, thank you. I hope that wasn't too bad. Anyway, he made the arrangement to be able to do this at the end of the season. It was a game that people didn't pay a great deal of attention to. But he did not make it all the way through the National League lineup, let alone any opportunity to pitch to the American League. It wore him out just to face 9 batters. And in the middle of it all, people were knocking that ball all around the park. He was a high school pitcher, but he didn't have a lot of zip on it. All he could do was get it into that strike zone. And he had wrote a very interesting article about it afterwards, but he had a feeling like you don't get when you're a real athlete. The things that happened that were going wrong didn't really bother him. Thank you so much. As an example of that, he gave up a tape measure home run. And have you ever watched a pitcher after they give up a home run ball? They're looking at the ground, they're kicking the dirt around, you know. They will not watch the ball, they will not watch that guy circling those bases. They just act like it didn't even happen. Not George. He just pitched a home run ball and he turned around and watched it go out of the stadium. And said, I had this odd feeling of accomplishment. Like I had helped make something really cool happen. As that ball got smaller, he thought, wow, look what we did. Not your typical reaction of somebody who's just failed. But he wrote about his failure and then got thinking, you know, I want to do this again. This was kind of fun, but I made a mistake. I didn't prepare for it. What I need to do is train. Get a coach to get me ready for another athletic event. And he made an arrangement to do another athletic event against a world-class professional. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd have chosen tennis or bowling, maybe. I promise you I wouldn't have chosen boxing. George Plimpton decided to go boxing. And there he is after a 3-round bout with the then light heavyweight champion of the world, Archie Moore. Now, an interesting sidebar, Archie Moore, years later, became a Seventh-day Adventist. And he did a lot of work among inner-city youth in Los Angeles. Now, back to the story, you can see how slender and non-boxing George Plimpton looks. But he did hire a trainer, and he got ready for the match, and he learned all of the moves and what to do with his feet and everything else. But as the match approached, something unfortunate happened. George had a friend who was also a friend of Archie Moore's. And this friend happened to be in a restaurant and saw Archie Moore, and he walked over to him to say hi. And then he said, hey, I hear you're going to have a match against my friend George Plimpton. And a champ said, yeah, I don't know what it is. Some writer want to get an article out of it. And his friend decided to have a little fun. And he said, oh, no, yeah, George writes articles, but really, he's a fairly good amateur boxer. And he'd like to go professional. And he thinks if he does decently against you, that he's going to be able to start fighting on a higher card. Well, Archie Moore thought if you want to get to the top, you got to fight your way to the top, and you don't start in the middle to get there. So he thought, I'm going to teach this guy a lesson. And then George's friend realized he was taking him seriously, and he said, no, I'm just kidding, but he couldn't convince him of that. So when the fight came along, they ring the bell, and the two guys come out of their corner, and Archie Moore is ready to do a whooping on George. But by the time they got to the center ring, just watching him walk across, he knew this is a rider. There's not a boxer in this guy. So he started taking it, I'll come right around that if you do that. And so George is trying to follow all of these instructions and remember everything he'd been taught. And after a while, he begins to realize, he's taking it easy on me. And if I really want to write about the experience, I'm going to have a fight on my hands. So I told Archie Moore, you got to hit me, man. And he said, I don't want to hurt you. I said, yeah, but I'm writing this article, and it isn't going to be anything if I don't know what it's like to get hit. Okay. He said, I never saw it coming. The only thing he saw coming was the floor. Didn't knock him out. He got up and he went through the rest of the fight. And then he went back to his hotel room and he said, while my head was ringing like a telephone, I wrote the experience out while I could still taste the blood in my mouth. And Atlantic magazine picked up the article And all of a sudden, everybody was talking about George Plimpton. And everybody said, what's he going to do next? Well, next turned out to be football. There he is, number 0, face down. He spent the 1963 training camp with the Detroit Lions and learning how to play quarterback. Now, he tried his hand at various other things. He, went out for a receiver and did running back for a little bit. But most of his time learning at quarterback, because they were going to let him play one series, 4 downs, in a scrimmage, Lions against Lions. No other team was going to get involved. Insurance made sure of that. And he went out there and, again, failed miserably as a quarterback. On one of the plays, all he had to do, first one, you take the snap and you turn and hold the ball out. That's it. The running back's going to come past you and take that ball, and it's not your problem anymore. And he practiced it, and then they got into actual, let's play at game conditions. And he turned around with that ball, and there was nobody there because he had already gone by. That fast. Well, they practiced for that. And he knew that my job now is I got to follow that running back and hope for the best. So he followed him, but the line collapsed around him almost immediately. And George suddenly realized that his eyes were tightly closed, but he was still upright, and his feet were running. But they weren't on the ground. So he opens his eyes, and he's looking face mask to face mask in at a big lineman by the name of Lucian Rehberg, who had one arm around George, and with the other hand, he was feeling for the football to try and force a fumble. And he was smiling, because he rarely got an opportunity this good. So he was a failure at everything, but when he wrote the book, Paper Lion, it was a New York Times bestseller. And suddenly everybody wanted George to do something. He was a trapeze artist with the Cole Brothers Circus. He raced the Baja 1000. He played tennis against Pablo Casals. And every time he would do this, he would write an article or a book about it. And George Plimpton became famous. ABC picked him up for a series of these attempted athletic things, at which he failed miserably because he's no better athlete than any one of us in this room. But he wrote what great athletes could do that mortals like us can't. And his teammates loved him. They said it was like one of those guys up in the stands who was shouting down insults at them while eating hot dogs. Suddenly was brought onto the field and said, okay, you think the Chicago defense is so easy? Here's the football, try it. And as his popularity grew, it even expanded into other areas. There was a New Yorker cartoon once of a lady who was laying on a gurney, draped and ready for surgery, and all the doctors are standing around her with their masks on and their scrubs. And just before they put her under, she's looking at the doctor and says, wait a minute, how do I know you're not George Plimpton? Well, that would worry you, wouldn't it? Because he didn't know what he was doing, but he was writing great stuff about it. And as he got older, he reached a point where he said, I don't want to do it anymore. It hurts. So I want to start taking it easy. And then he gets a call from Sports Illustrated again, and they said, we got another assignment for you. And he says, yeah, I'm not doing it anymore. And they said, we've already made the arrangements with the team. He says, no, I'm finished. You start on Tuesday, and we got the ticket already bought for you. So George Plimpton went off and did the one thing crazier than boxing. Hockey. That's him on his face again. This time he's 00. He played 5 minutes in an exhibition game as goalie for the Boston Bruins as they played against the Philadelphia Flyers. You know, you don't have to do a whole lot of skating as the goalie. You get to sit back a little bit, which was good news for George. But it was not a good experience. Excuse me. Once again, he was an abject failure. The puck was flying past him into the net left and right. And he said under real game conditions, he was always looking where the puck had just been. Every time he looked here, it was over there, and he'd move his eyes over here, and it was gone already. So the next thing he knew, it was in the net behind him. I don't know what the actual score was in his 5 minutes, but I do know towards the end of it, one of his teammates committed a flagrant foul. Now that's a situation that requires the other team to get a penalty shot. And George always suspected that they'd done this flagrant foul on purpose, just so he could have the experience. A penalty shot is the goalie gets in the net, everybody else is all the way at the other end of the ice, and one guy from the other team gets to skate up and take a shot at you. One free shot with nobody interrupting him. And the guy they chose, his name happened to be Reggie Leach. Interesting, there's a Reggie Leach who is treasurer of the Arizona Conference, good friend of mine. Not the same guy. Anyway, this Reggie Leach comes in, and George is remembering his training, which said, move out from the net a little bit. It reduces his angles. And just as Leach cranks back to make his shot, George goes down flat on the ice. See, there's a strategy to that. If you're laying down, the puck can't get under you. And then you got this giant mitten on up here that you can reach up and try to grab it or smack it out of the way if he's shooting over you. So George is going down on the ice, and Reggie Leach cranks back and hits his shot, which ricochets off of George's skate and wide of the goal. And the whole stadium goes nuts. And George's teammates pour out onto the ice, and they pick him up on their shoulders, and they start spinning him around the rink. And the bedlam is so loud that his teammates can't hear what he's trying to tell them. I fell down. Sometimes the best strategy is to just get lucky. Well, that was it for his athletic adventures, and George decided, I really am done this time. But after a while, he discovered that in his heart, it was hard to let go of. He had spent time around really terrific athletes, people that he made friends with, and he had not earned his place among them, so he was always a little bit, in awe of all of them, and he missed it. And he thought, where can I get that feeling again of being around the best of the best in the world, even though I don't deserve to be among them as a performer? And he hit on an idea. I'm going to try my hand in music. I'm going to join a symphony orchestra and play with the best of the best. Now, there's a problem with this. You see, in athletics, mistakes are happening all the time. You're going to have 3 or 4 major mistakes on a play that results in a score. That doesn't happen in music. When you're the best of the best, you can't afford mistakes in a concert. None of the players are allowed mistakes. So you can't just walk in to, the Chicago Symphony and suggest that you'd like to sit in on fiddle. They're not going to have you. But he decided, I'm going to make the rounds and talk to different conductors and see if somebody has an idea of how I could join an orchestra. And it turns out somebody did. Leonard Bernstein, world famous conductor of the New York Philharmonic. And he said, George, I think I could put you in the percussion section on some of the simplest instruments. Like 2 blocks of wood that you smack together, like you did in kindergarten. Can you keep time? Well, he could keep time. All right, let's try you out in percussion. And so he's doing the various different instruments and percussion, but in the actual symphonies, they let him in on the performances, but only briefly, and he would do things like play a triangle. Nothing too complicated. But one day, in a symphony, or, in a concert, George messed up when he was just shaking some sleigh bells. I don't know how you messed that up, but he managed. Well, that was it, out of the orchestra. World famous conductor Leonard Bernstein was not going to have mistakes happening in his concerts. So he fired George on the spot. Well, by now he'd made a lot of friends in the percussion section, and so they took him out to dinner that night to console him. And as they're talking about what happened, they said, Bernstein's a temperamental artist. And he's just having a little bit of a fit here. He'll get over it, and we'll get your job back. And George said, well, I've worked with head coaches and umpires and various other people, and they don't seem to have a sense of humor about these things. Don't worry. It's going to work out fine. So the next morning, all of the percussion section files into Bernstein's office with George along with them, who won't look up now. He can look up at home runs going over the fence, but he's not going to look up and see this conductor. And they all start pleading his case. And George can hear Bernstein's having none of it. Nope, this isn't the bush leagues, this is the majors, and we are not going to mess up again. But after a few minutes, as George listened, he thought the conductor might be softening a little bit. And finally, Bernstein says, well, and George dared to look up, and there he is looking straight at him, sternly. He says, I tell you what, in 3 weeks, we're going to be performing a concert in Winnipeg, Canada. We're going to be doing Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony. And I'm going to give you one note. And you're not going to mess up. Because I am going to give you the most obvious direction in the history of performed music. So you're not going to miss your note. Now get out of my office and practice. And George's one note was going to be played on a giant gong, 5 feet across. Right at the crescendo of Tchaikovsky's second, there's a big wong on this thing. And all George has to do is hit it. But you have to understand where to stand in relation to the gong, what angle your body must be at, where your feet should be placed, how to flex your knees, where on that mallet to grip, and how you hold it when you begin the swing, so you're going to hit it exact the right time, how fast to be hitting, where on the face of that gong you want to strike, and when you need to start, so it comes in at the right moment. All of these things at once. And George practiced for 3 weeks, one note. And he said it was more intense than football and hockey and baseball all together could make it, because he dared not fail. And he made a career out of failing and writing about it, but for the first time, he really desperately wanted to succeed. And the fear of failure haunted him. He bought a record player, and if you're under 50, you can look it up later on the internet, and a recording of Tchaikovsky's second. And every night after the rest of the symphony had performed the concert, and they got into the hotel room, George would put on that record and listen for his moment and do a little bit of air gong. And he said, I felt sorry for the other musicians because they're done with music for the day, and here I am playing music in the hotel at night. They never said anything because they all wanted George to succeed. They were pulling for him. The night of the concert came, and George sat down in a chair at the back of the orchestra wearing his tuxedo and not moving while everybody else played their music. And when it came to Tchaikovsky's symphony, he had the rosin on his hands. He put his feet on the tape marks that they put on the floor for him. He got his mallet and held it exactly right. And looked up at the conductor. Bernstein looked at him, make sure he's in position, and then started the symphony. And through the whole thing, George is standing there, barking off the measures, waiting for his moment. And as they got closer, he began to hear that the rest of the percussion section was counting off the beat, making sure that he had it and was on time. He got his arms up, ready to go. And when his moment approached, he heard the principal of the percussion section hit it, just as Bernstein turned toward him, swung the baton towards him, his eyes bugging out, his teeth clenched, and said, "No!" And George hit that gong harder than a gong has ever been hit. And he said the sound was so loud and sudden that the musicians in front of him jumped like beans on a hot griddle. And it rolled through the concert hall and echoed back up to the stage, so loud that Bernstein had to pause the orchestra for a measure or two just to let the sound die down before he could continue with the duo. And George was crushed. He stood there looking at his feet, panting, a melon in his hands, and thinking, I blew it. It was way too loud. Maybe just a little bit too soon, even. I had one note, and I couldn't do it. And then he began hearing a soft little sound. I didn't know this until I read this article, that musicians have a way of applauding one another in the middle of a performance that we out in the audience don't hear. They softly shuffle their feet to say, hey, that section you were having trouble with, I got through it. And that solo, really nicely done. And George heard the sound of the entire New York Philharmonic Orchestra shuffling their feet, and suddenly realized, that's for me. And he looked up, right at Bernstein, who's looking right back at him, and his arms are conducting the music, but on his face there is a smile. And he nodded his head and mouthed the word, yes. And when the piece was finished, the entire orchestra joined the audience in a standing ovation for George, while Bernstein had him take a bow. George Plimpton, a lifelong failure, who had made a career out of failing, was a one-note triumph. And a couple weeks later, he messed up another concert and got fired again. This time permanently, but it didn't matter because now he had his story. He had finally succeeded at something. Here's the point. If all of life, the history of the world, from the moment that God breathed life into Adam to the moment when the clouds roll aside and Jesus comes back, was a single, very long piece of music, then any one of our lives is simply one note in it. That's all you get. And most of us are not going to be a blast on a trumpet in the middle of a solo. We're a little chirp on a piccolo during warm-up. But you know, the conductor hears every note. And he knows what each person in that symphony is doing at any second. And he has placed each note where it needs to be. And he's listening. And something that nobody else could hear, the conductor hears. And here we are, living our little one-note lives. How are we supposed to do it? I think George's experience is very instructive. First of all, you got to take it seriously. Second, you got to practice living well. Third, you got to listen to those who have gone before you and who know what they're talking about. Fourth, keep your eye on the conductor. And finally, when your time comes, give it all you got. Because George's legacy was that forever afterward, when the New York Philharmonic was in practice and Bernstein wanted them to really emphasize a part, he would say, let's give this the Winnipeg sound. That's the result of a life well lived. That your conductor can say, look at that. That's someone who did what I wanted them to do. And so I try to put all of those things into my life, and I keep running up against this. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's my legacy. That's who I am. It's the reality that I live. And nothing I can do erases it. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Because in 2 Corinthians 5:21, it also tells us, God made him. Who's the him in this? Okay, so God made Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Which means that though I have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, he took that on him and gave me in its place his righteousness, so that I am not what I appear to be in my own eyes. I'm something else in the eyes of God. And someday, that's going to matter. You see, I know what I think, or I know what I'm going to be thinking when I see Jesus face to face. I know right now what I will be aware of. I just haven't got any clue how deeply I'm going to feel it. I will know in that moment that I am a failure. And I'll know that because I can look back at my life right now and see how it's gone. And you can too. But here's the thing. On that day, the shuffling applause of the world will mean nothing. The only thing I want is to be able to look up into the eyes of my conductor and see a smile. And hear him say, well done. Well done. Good and faithful servant. I gave you one note. And because of my son in my ears, no matter what you think of your performance, it was perfect. Enter into the joy of your Lord.